Yeah, of course. Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. So, Bulabinaka to everyone that's listening in tonight. Thank you for joining us for this session on domestic abuse. Before I go into introducing our main speaker for the night, I'll just go over a few things, which will include an introduction about Mark, the structure of tonight's talk, as well as just a few things on our guidelines for our conversation. So for those of you that would be new to Marama Alliance UK, basically it is a network of Fijian women in the UK, and our work is aimed at connecting women to allow for better ease into the greater UK community. We create safe spaces where women can connect, share information, and we also connect them to service providers and information sources like the Domestic Abuse Forum, which we are doing tonight. As mentioned, tonight's session is a focus on domestic abuse, and we had started touching on this a few weeks back in the session on relationships, and this was facilitated by advisory board member Childline Riley, who is also a member of the Army Welfare Services, so AWS. And we're very lucky tonight to have with us Mrs. Karen Evans, who is a member of the Domestic Abuse Forum, who will help us delve into the topic a bit more. As you'd be aware, it's a bit of a sensitive topic, one that can bring out certain emotions, or it can be quite triggering for some, but we're lucky that we have with us someone who's worked in the area of domestic abuse for many years and who would be able to carry the discussion with us. Just in terms of the community guidelines for our session, as you are aware, Karen is volunteering her time. It's quite late in the evening, and she's volunteering her time to share information with us, or share with us things that she's gathered in her work over many years. So we ask that we will respect that, and yes, you can pose questions, but we ask that you be mindful that it is a constructive way that is done, and that only things that are relevant to the conversation is happening, and that is in being mindful and respectful of the space. And also to feel free to ask the questions if you have questions, and feel free to engage. This is a space we have created for you, and we welcome whatever questions you may have or whatever contribution you would like to make to the space. Having said that, the structure for the session will include an introduction by myself and Karen, and then there are 3 sections to the presentation. The first one will cover what is domestic abuse. The second one will talk on the prevalence here in the UK. And the third one will cover sources of support. And also important to note, at the end of each section, we'll allow a time for questions to be asked, and Karen will answer those. So as the section is being discussed, feel free to ask the questions then instead of waiting until the end. So that's very roughly on the community guidelines and the structure of tonight's talk. Just to start off with, I'll introduce myself before Karen will then introduce herself. So I'm Philomena Tuivonolevu. I'm a committee member of Marama Alliance UK. I'm from Bua, Wasuim Bua. I live in Fleet, Hampshire with my husband Celestino Nangarese, who is from Koro. And I enjoy crafting and reading. And that's about it from me. I'll now ask Karen if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. I know it's quite a difficult subject to discuss, so really, really grateful for you for giving up your time this evening. So yeah, so my name's Karen. I chair the Domestic Abuse Forum for North East Hampshire, and that's really all around bringing together all the agencies that work to help and support people affected by domestic abuse, so that if anybody needs any help, be they a victim living in a relationship which is quite abusive, quite controlling, if they're a perpetrator who wants help to change their behaviours, or if they're a child young person living within these households, we want to make sure that all the services are there to support you and help you. So I've been doing this since 2004, but particularly interested in how domestic abuse affects different people. So everyone is a unique individual, but we also have kind of common issues that affect us all, and kind of ways in which we would understand domestic abuse, the way that our relationships are formed, how we kind of work with each other in our families and our communities. So I live in Fleet, Hampshire as well, which is brilliant. So it was great when we kind of found that I had that in common with Philo. And really interested in this area. Obviously, we've got a lot of armed forces families, and I've been really interested the time I've been here in kind of trying to reach out to the armed forces families and see how we can work together, how we can sort of support each other. So really interested in that. So born and bred in the Midlands, born at Wolverhampton Hospital, and lived there really until, well, I suppose, late 20s when I got married. With my husband, his job was moved to Germany for 2 years. We lived in Essen because his role was very much involved with supporting the armed forces bases in Germany and doing work on those. So we lived there for 2 years and then came back, and again to a military area just by coincidence, really. So both my parents were from the Midlands. My mum lived, she was born in Brierley Hill in the West Midlands, and my dad was from Dudley in the West Midlands, and they actually met at the Methodist Church in Brierley Hill. So strong Methodist community, really, and I understand quite a lot of people from Fiji are Methodists as well, so hopefully have that connection. Hobbies wise, I used to be quite good at doing crafts and things, but I've been a bit lazy recently, I must admit. But I play the organ at church on Sundays when we were allowed to meet in the churches. So interested in playing the piano and music and crafts when I can. But that's a little bit about me.
Thank you very much, Karen. So I had as I had explained earlier, for us as Fijians or Pacific Islanders, when we meet, it's common that we will recite genealogies to try and place the other person, and also to see how we will connect. So obviously our connection with you would be your work in the military community, your involvement with the Methodist Church. There is a large number of Methodists in Fiji, and a large Methodist presence who have contributed a lot to the development of Fiji and continue to do so. So that is quite interesting to see that connection. So thank you for that. And if that's all right, we will now move into the first section of your presentation on what is domestic abuse.
Yes, of course, that's great, thank you. So I just thought it was helpful just to give you a bit of context to start with, just to kind of think about what domestic abuse is, how it's defined in this country, and then kind of prevalence. There'll be quite a few things that are similar with Fiji, other things that might be different. It might also be that you've moved around the world linked to the armed forces, or different reasons that you kind of moved around, really. So kind of thinking about how things in this country work. Also included a bit of a section on the criminal justice system. So we thought it might be helpful for you to kind of have a walk through that system. So from when someone first reports a crime to the final outcomes, and how that kind of all fits together. So I think sometimes it's really important you understand the processes, but when you're perhaps deciding to report a crime or what actions you might want to take, I think it just gives you a bit of confidence if you know what's going to happen. And it's quite empowering sometimes to kind of, understand the system. So in terms of what domestic abuse is, there's a definition that's been adopted really across all of the services in the United Kingdom. And it's not a legal definition at the moment. It's just kind of words that try and incorporate what sort of things we're talking about. At the moment, I don't know if you're aware, but there is a domestic abuse bill which is going through the House of Parliament, and that is looking to put this definition into a legal framework. So at the moment, you can't be taken to court for domestic abuse. You have to go to court for a specific type of crime, but then there's that domestic context around it. So they're kind of looking at how that can be changed. One of the key changes to the definition on the screen is that they're looking to widen where it says financial abuse. That's going to be changed to economic abuse. Because when we think about financial, a lot of people just think about money, whereas actually it's all about how money can impact someone's ability to do things. So how work can be impacted, how someone who's quite controlling can sort of have a lot of control over your life if they can control your work, your economic well-being. So the definition is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members regardless of gender or sexuality. So it's quite wordy really, but what it's kind of talking about, it can be an individual incident or it can be that pattern, that build-up of incidents that sort of really seek to control for someone to have power over another person. Where we're kind of thinking about those aged 16 or over, we're thinking about people 16 and 17-year-olds in dating relationships, teenage relationships, and the definition includes them even though they're still legally children, because it was recognised that they might need to access the support services that are there to support everyone or the victims of domestic abuse. So as well as intimate partners, so it's not just husband and wife, it's kind of wider family members. So we're looking at siblings, so that's brothers and sisters over the age of 16. It can be parent to child or child to parent, where both people are over the age of 16. And it can also be like ex-partners. So somebody who's got intimate knowledge of you, somebody who kind of knows you, who knows what's likely to upset you, how they might be able to control you and that whole definition really. Family members as well, who are going to know about some of your secrets maybe, and if they're at that mindset, how they might use that to try and control you, to get you to do things. So that really kind of quite big definition, you know, just thinking about that, you know, what makes it different compared to if you're perhaps a stranger in the street who has a crime committed against you, to if you're in that family, that loving relationship, or what should be a loving relationship, how that impacts you differently. So controlling and coercive behaviour has been further broken down. So controlling behaviour is really about where someone is quite sort of clear they're trying to control someone. So they might make them do things. They're kind of, you must do this, you must do that. If you don't, there's going to be consequences. Coercive behaviour is a bit more nuanced. So coercive behaviour is where you kind of get someone to do things that they might think they're doing on their own, but it's because they want to try and keep on the right side of their perpetrator. So for example, a difference would be if I say my tea has to be on the table at 6 o'clock, or else you're going to be punished, I'm going to hit you, I'm going to do whatever. That would be controlling behaviour. Coercive behaviour would be if I decided that in order to keep things nice and calm at home, I would have the tea ready at 6. So it's the same end result, but the one is where I'm being told to do something. The other is where I feel that I might have a choice in doing it, but the only reason I'm doing that is to try and keep the peace in the household. So coercive control is like quite a new sort of concept, but really important because it really kind of picks up on that emotional abuse that someone might be experiencing, sort of really kind of much more than that, just thinking about physical abuse when we talk about domestic abuse. So say at the moment it's not a legal definition, and it also includes so-called honour-based violence. So that's where the violence could come from any member of the family, where there's been shame involved, they want to restore shame, female genital mutilation, and also forced marriage. So that's very different to if someone's got an arranged marriage. It's where someone is put under a lot of pressure to get married. And those all of those come within that definition of domestic abuse. Very clear, not confined to one gender or ethnic group. This is an issue that goes across all communities, male, female, regardless of sexuality, gender, what ethnic group you are. Domestic abuse it's kind of there across all communities. So really kind of picking up on that. So in terms of the kind of forms, what you'll find is that there's a lot of overlaps between the different forms as we put them, but sometimes it helps just to break it down a little. So psychological abuse is where somebody sort of plays mind games with somebody, so they make them feeling they're going mad. You might even have heard of the phrase gaslighting. So where things sort of are happening and the person kind of just really questions themselves. They think they've done something, but then actually the evidence is contrary to that. And really somebody getting inside somebody else's head, making them feel they can't manage on their own. Physical abuse is the one that we're kind of much more familiar with, really. So we're thinking about the bruises, the broken bones, that kind of physical harm that's done to somebody. We're thinking about sexual abuse as well. And with all of these, it's kind of the whole spectrum. So sexual abuse can be rape at the kind of top end, you know, the highest sort of risk levels, but it can also somebody saying, I'm not going to have sex with you because you haven't behaved today, or I don't like what you're wearing, or, you know, that kind of whole spectrum really of what that behaviour might be. Also, perhaps forcing someone to watch pornographic material, making them do things they feel uncomfortable about sexually. And with sexual abuse, again, it's quite interesting because quite often if you're kind of forced to do something sexually you don't feel comfortable with, that can really impact on you, can make you feel a lot of shame. So actually you feel you can't report what's happening because you'd have to disclose that. So again, really quite, you know, something that somebody might use, you know, to try and control you in that sort of most degrading of ways. Financial abuse, I say it's going to be wider economic, but that can be anything from one person having total control over the money. So perhaps saying you're only allowed £5 a week to spend on shopping or whatever, so really controlling all the finances. But it can also be that somebody has to hand over all their wages, or it might be the flip of that, that they're not allowed to have a job, you know, that you should be at home, you know, you shouldn't be working. It can be somebody monitoring someone's mileage on the car. So really those kind of nuanced ways in which someone can exert power and control over another person. And the emotional abuse, which is the name calling, making someone feel useless, worthless, sort of eroding their self-esteem. So I say a lot of these interlink, and you will normally find that they're all sort of coexisting with each other. You know, you wouldn't normally get any forms of those without the emotional abuse being part of it as well. So always kind of interlinking. But I say sometimes it helps when you're thinking about how do people recognise that they're actually in an abusive relationship. Sometimes by breaking it down to look at these factors, that can be quite helpful to people to understanding that. So in terms of the prevalence in the UK, we know from the crime survey from England and Wales, which asks people actually, what is your experience of domestic abuse? What is your experience? Have you experienced crime this year in your lifetime? And these figures consistently show 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men be a victim of domestic abuse during their lifetime. Also 1 in 4 people in same-sex relationships and 1 in 4 dating relationships is also abusive. So I say these are the numbers of people that are saying this is what's happened to me. You know, this is something I've experienced. Not all of these people will have reported their abuse to the police. In fact, the vast majority of people might not have done. So this is looking at what's actually happening there, and then we can relate that then to how many people are actually having the confidence to report what's happening. We know that 30% of domestic abuse starts in pregnancy. I don't know if you've got any ideas about why that might be, but when you think about how when someone's pregnant, there's a lot of focus on the pregnant lady. So people want to kind of be involved, you get a lot of practitioners, professionals sort of interested in you, and actually somebody who's been living, who's quite controlling in a relationship and who wants to be the centre of that person's world, suddenly pregnancy can really change things. It changes the focus, the dynamics in a relationship, and it can be a trigger for some people for that domestic abuse to start. I've kind of put a little bit as well about the children, the impact on children, because quite often people stay in an abusive relationship because of how they feel it's impacting on the child. And they might kind of say the child doesn't know what's happening, they're not in the same room, but actually we know that the children, even from a very young age, they are absorbing what's happened, and it does impact on them quite significantly. You know, in terms of their physical safety, so we know that about 1/3 to 2/3 of children where there's domestic abuse in the household, they'll also be abused directly themselves, like physical abuse, emotional abuse. And also we know that even if the child isn't in the same room, you know, a lot of them will be, a lot of, you know, even more will be in the next room. So seeing what's happening, perhaps hearing what's going on. So really impacting on their development and how they kind of feel about their safety, what they need to do, and also how they can be kind of torn really because they want to protect the person who's getting hurt, but by trying to intervene, how that kind of places them in danger. So I know that the figures, you know, I have seen prevalence rates for Fiji. So I know that, again, domestic abuse is quite a common issue. in Fiji, a lot of people will experience domestic abuse. And again, it's all really around, it's happening everywhere in the world. It's just kind of how the impact of that is, and actually how much confidence people have in the support services and whether they're able to report what's happening.
Yep, there was a very interesting first few slides that you've presented through, Karen. Thank you for that. Just to start off with some points at the top of my head, I wondered about things like revenge porn. Does that fall under domestic abuse, or is that separate altogether? Things that happen online?
Yeah, so it's a separate offence. So as you'll see when we go through a bit later, so that domestic abuse is quite a lot of crime types that it might be. So yes, revenge porn can come into that. And again, it's about how someone might control someone. So potentially they've been in a relationship, you've kind of shared these really intimate pictures or this information, and then actually somebody afterwards sharing that wider. So yes, very much comes within that. So there are specific laws around revenge porn, which again, so there is sort of more protection. That's quite a new sort of thing, a new law that came into place to recognise the impact that that has on somebody.
Mm-hmm. It was also interesting to note the control and coercion bit of domestic abuse. For Fijian women in the UK, most of us are here as part of joining our spouses who have come to work or join the military, and it has meant leaving our usual social networks in Fiji and our family, and to move to a completely new country and to sort of try and find or rebuild those networks as adults, really. And often, I imagine with domestic abuse, those networks would be important, to trigger those red flags for you, or to where the safety net you'd run to in situations of violence or where your safety is at risk. So I guess the point I was trying to make was, for communities like the Fijian women in the UK, there might be a degree of, I guess, vulnerability due to the isolation that we find ourselves in, without the support of our usual social networks in a new country where we've settled in.
Yeah, you're absolutely right with that. And somebody who's quite controlling in a relationship, often they want to be the centre of the universe for that person. They really want to control everything. And actually a really key element of achieving that control is around isolating them from other sources of support. So absolutely, if you can take somebody from their family, their friends and everything, and get that whole world built around you, that is absolutely, a really kind of important factor when we talk about domestic abuse. And also it's difficult really, because then if you're totally reliant on someone, who do you talk to about what's happening? Particularly for armed forces spouses, potentially if you're here as a spousal visa, you have to kind of make a choice sometimes. Are you going to live with what you're experiencing, sort of put up with it, or what's the consequences if you try and leave? Will you then have to go back to Fiji? How does that impact on you? How will your friends, your family back there, how will they react that your marriage is broken down? All those kind of things. And actually a lot of pressure put on people to actually remain within the relationship, even when there is abuse happening, when they're perhaps quite unhappy, quite scared, perhaps being physically abused, emotionally abused. And actually those are kind of really massive decisions to make. Do you sort of leave, do you get rid of that sort of abusive relationship? But actually what happens, what you're going to do for money, where are you going to live? What about your immigration status? All those things. And although there are solutions, there is support around that, that is absolutely truly massive. And I don't sort of underestimate at all that pressure. And again, if you haven't got friends, family saying, I've really noticed you've changed, so you're much quieter, you seem really quite nervous, you don't have the confidence you used to have, all those kind of things. If people don't know you, if you haven't got friends around you, if you're not getting anybody, feeding that back in, people's confidence can go down and down and down without sort of anyone really picking up what's happened. So absolutely. Isolation is a massive thing, yes.
And then, as you had mentioned, often the personalities around domestic abuse would often be someone who's very charming, manipulative. So the perception in the community is certainly he can't be, or she can't be that. And often when the person who is being abused comes forward, sometimes people don't believe her. And it makes it harder for reporting or coming forward because, those things don't match up.
Absolutely. And I mean, if the person was really horrible and looked really violent and aggressive and was like that, then probably nobody would ever fall for them in the first place.
Absolutely.
And there's a process really. When you meet someone, you kind of present your best self. So like kind of when we first go out with someone, we like kind of dress up, don't we? Put a bit of makeup on, all these kind of things. You're charming, you give information about yourself, and actually really kind of open yourself up a bit. And the other person is reflecting back sometimes, their best self. And actually sort of as things progress, then the relationship can really change. And actually you kind of see a totally different side to that person. Mm-hmm. I don't know, do the Fijian ladies like to watch Coronation Street?
Oh yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I don't know whether you're kind of following that storyline at the moment with Yasmin, but again, how she kind of really changed, how Jeff isolated her, and he seems to be like a really good guy, doesn't he? And sort of one of the lads and all this kind of thing, but actually at home, a totally different situation. Mm-hmm. And again, if people were like they are at home in their relationships, they're controlling relationships, actually, they would alienate everyone, but unfortunately, they're able to compartmentalise. And with domestic abuse, it's very different to kind of anger management and sort of general anger, because the person isn't angry at the whole world and lashing out at everyone normally. It's very kind of targeted, and that's the domestic element of it. So targeting that one person. And how they kind of can really change behind closed doors to the outside world presentation.
Yeah, and for like the economic impact of domestic abuse, and for situations where the perpetrator is the only income earner, and I imagine it would also then affect the possibility of, say, someone who is in a violent situation being able to apply for visas to secure, your immigration status, to secure safety for you and your kids. I wonder if, before we move on to the next session, if you could touch on the kinds of support that would be available. I know you'll touch on that later on, but yes. I guess yeah.
Yeah, of course, no problem. So for a lot of people, when you do leave a relationship, there is going to be a really big economic impact initially. So especially if you're reliant on the husband or the wife's wages and everything, suddenly that's gone. You might have subsidised housing at the moment, but then you've got to look at a market rent for a property. All those kind of things. Might be school costs, as if you have to move to a different area, uniform costs for the children, etc. So quite often, there is quite a significant impact on finances initially. And even if you've got the potential to get a really good job in the future, is normally a lot of people sort of go through that dip first before they can start building up again. So there is support available. There's benefits are available. If people need to access refuge accommodation and they haven't got any funding, again, there's help with that. It is a bit complicated where you've got no recourse to public funding. Mm-hmm. So a lot of support that people would be able to have if they have got settled status, it isn't always as easily accessible. So there's what's called the Domestic Violence Discretionary Fund. So there are sort of options around people who haven't got any recourse to public funding. So where there's domestic abuse, it's recognised that that is an issue and could stop someone from leaving a relationship. So there is a fund available for that. You can also apply for immigration status, so independent leave to remain. Again, there's a domestic violence route. And I don't know if Catherine touched on that from Army Families Federation in her talk a couple of weeks ago, but she's a real specialist on that. And she will help people one-to-one with all their forms that they need to do and actually really helping them with that process.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So just to reiterate that, I guess for women or spouses first coming over, you come over through a visa that isn't really indefinite leave to remain. It's a spouse visa, and I think that one is the one where there is no entitlement to public funds. So just to reiterate that there is support available in cases of domestic abuse. that people can access. And also it is possible for victims of domestic abuse to apply for leave to remain independently of the perpetrator if they find themselves in a situation that's not safe.
Absolutely, yeah. That's correct. And I say, Catherine from Army Families Federation, a real expert in this field. So any questions anyone might have about actually the processes, you know, you can always sort of turn to her and Army Families Federation for help with that.
Wonderful. Yes, so for those of you listening in and interested in contact, Catherine Holston is the lady who was the main speaker for our last immigration session, and her contact details and the link to their website is also available on our Facebook page if you just scroll down to one of our previous posts. So having said that, Karen, would you like to move on to the next section of your presentation?
Yeah, that's great, thank you. So in this section, I kind of really wanted to talk through for everyone actually what happens around the English criminal justice system. There might be some things that are similar to how it works in Fiji, or you know, where you've been based before. There might be some differences. So this is kind of a step-by-step as to what happens at each stage. So every single crime is going to be unique. So the way that it's investigated can be different in each case, but there will be these kind of basic steps in place, so I can kind of talk you through them. So the first step is that a crime is reported. So it might be, sorry, thank you. So it might be criminal damage, for example, or it might be domestic abuse. It could be any crime. And if it's an instant, a crime that's happening now or something urgent, so for example, if someone's being assaulted, if a crime's taking place, call 999 and the police will respond to that. With domestic abuse, they do take every call that comes through as domestic very seriously. So that will get quite a high level of response. So they will send someone as soon as they possibly can. If it's a low-level crime or something that perhaps happened a couple of days ago, so it's not in process at the moment, you can call 101 and report that. So that's the first stage, is that actually the crime is reported. This is a picture from the Hampshire control room. I don't know whether they probably had to space it out a bit with social distancing at the moment, but so you've got a bank of people really working on their computers, and they get all the reports come in, so the 999 calls come in, and then they're able to dispatch somebody if it needs an immediate response, and also do the first processing, the first starting of an investigation to work out what's actually happening. So with the police, when a report's made, obviously they then need to kind of think about what's happening, who's involved in that. So you're most likely going to have a victim, and you're going to have a perpetrator or someone who's been accused of an offence. So for example, with domestic abuse, the victim would say what's happened, perhaps it's been assault, something's happened. They'll give the information, make a statement, and then if the police think there's a reason to continue with that, they will then arrest the suspect. So at this point, they are only called a suspect because we don't know whose account is correct at this point. But the person will normally be arrested if there's any evidence of a crime taking place, and then they'll be interviewed at the police station. The next stage is that the police collate all the information that they found out. So they'll be talking to each of the people involved. That will include children. So if, say, you call the police to a domestic abuse incident, they'll separate the parties, speak to the person who's made the phone call, speak to the other person, try and find out what's going on, and then also check on the well-being of the children and actually ask the children as well if they know what's happened, what have they heard, or anybody else who's in the household. Might also speak to neighbours if there's neighbours around. Did you hear anything? You know, what did they say? What did they hear? So gathering all that information. And then once they've gathered all the information, they then have to present that to what's called the Crown Prosecution Service. And the Crown Prosecution Service are independent of the police, but they work very closely with them. And they're the organisation that kind of decides, is this going to move forward onto the next stage towards the court process. So all that evidence is collated, put into a folder for the Crown Prosecution, who then decide what's going to happen next. So Crown Prosecution have to decide on different thresholds as to what's happened. So they need to decide, have they got enough evidence that if it's put before a court, there's a realistic prospect that that person could be found guilty, that a decision will be made. And they also have to think about, is it in the public interest to pursue this case? So they have those two kind of thresholds they have to look at. I've kind of put in here that it makes absolutely no difference if anyone's wealthy or poor, if you're like high in the community, low in the community, that absolutely makes no difference whatsoever in the UK law. So everyone is treated absolutely equally. So there's no question that the police or the Crown Prosecution Service could be bribed or anything could happen to kind of, get them to make a specific decision like that. And I've put the Crown Prosecution Service, I've put their website address on the bottom. There's loads and loads of really useful information on their site. So for example, you were asking earlier about revenge porn. If you go to the CPS website, you can type in revenge porn and it'll come up with all the information about what that crime is, what evidence needs to be gathered, etc. So really, really useful website. So the depending on what the Crown Prosecution decide, if they decide it's going to go further, the suspect, they might be released on police bail. So that means that they're allowed to leave the police station, but they have to go back at another time to speak to the police about what's happened. So that might be if, say, there's further investigation the police need to do. It might be they're issued with a fixed penalty notice. So for lower level crimes, it might be that a fine is made or that's given as a caution. So they're kind of told that their behaviour is unacceptable. They're kind of issued with that penalty or with that caution. Or it might be that they're released with no further action. So the police have done their investigation, but actually there's not going to be any further action taken. Or alternatively, it might be that the person's remanded in custody, which is in prison. So the pictures I've got on the slide, sorry, so that's our new police investigation centre in Basingstoke. So it's quite a big centre. That's where a lot of the investigators, CID, that's where they work. That's where all the cells are for the whole of the North Hampshire area. It's a brand new custody suite, and the picture next to it is just inside one of the cells, and that's so you can see what sort of it's like. Normally the cell will have its own toilet and that within it, and outside the room there's a locker where possessions are kept. And then the other picture is of a prison. So somebody might be sort of kept in the police cells for a short time, or it might be they're then transferred to a prison. So if the case is going to proceed to court, then the suspect will be charged if that hasn't already taken place. So it'll be you're being arrested for this offence, and there's standard wording that's used to kind of make it very clear that that's the actual, they're actually being charged now with that. If it then continues to the next stage and it's going to go to court, there's then a date is set for when the case is going to be heard. And as a witness or a victim in the case, you'll be contacted by the witness care team, who can then tell you about the support available, about if you want to go and have a look around the court before the hearing, if you've got any issues with childcare or getting to the court, they're kind of there to support you as a witness to actually go and give your evidence. So when the case goes to court, there's three sort of main types of court. The first one is the Magistrates Court, and that deals with about 95% of criminal cases. So that would be perhaps assault, theft, criminal damage, issues like that. And it's actually, the cases are heard by lay magistrates. So they're volunteers who are magistrates, they have magistrate training, and three sit together so they can debate between each other to decide if someone's guilty or not guilty of the crime. In a magistrates court, you can also sometimes have a judge there, but say most times it's going to be lay magistrates, so volunteer magistrates. Crown Court hears more serious criminal cases, and the case there is heard by a judge and a jury. So a jury is made up of 12 members of the community, and anybody over the age of 18 can be called on to be a jury member. So that's much more serious cases. Our Crown Court is in Winchester, and they tend to be like perhaps rapes, threats to kill, really serious offences. And the reason that the decision is made about which court is that the magistrates court can only do punishments up to a certain level. So if it's a serious crime, it goes to Crown Court, because they can send people to prison for a much longer period. And then youth courts are where cases against 12 to 17-year-olds are held. So that's kind of a little bit sort of more relaxed in its format. So you don't tend to have, the judges with the wigs and all those sort of things. And they sort of specialise in hearing those cases against younger people. So decisions made on the verdict and the punishment. So the person's either found guilty or not guilty. And in a criminal court, the case has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. So that's quite different to a court where you're looking at balance of probability. So family courts, that type of thing. That was, on the balance of probability, they think it's probably, that crime has taken place in that way. So in the criminal court, though, it's beyond reasonable doubt. So a reasonable person would have to think that person is guilty of that offence. And if they're not sure about that, they have to find them not guilty. So it's a very high threshold to prove that guilt. So once somebody's found guilty, there's a number of options that are available to people, and the probation service help magistrates and judges decide what punishment to net out to someone. So that will come down to, is it their first offence? Have they done things like this before? How serious is the offence? What's likely to be most effective? So punishments can range from prison. It can be a community order, so they have to do a certain number of hours unpaid work. It can be a fine, so they have to pay money, or it can be that they have to go on a treatment programme. So for example, with domestic abuse, they might go on a behaviour change programme, or it could be a curfew. So I don't know if you've seen any of those tags on people's legs before. So they're only allowed to be out of the house between certain times, very much kind of monitored by the system. Okay, so that's a bit of a whistle-top tour. I hope that kind of made sense in that process.
It does. Thank you very much, Catherine. I guess just one question that had come in was, if I report domestic abuse, does that mean that my marriage will end? And I think this comes from that fear by women that as soon as they pick up that phone and call 999 to report abuse, that's the end of their marriage. And for most women, they just want the violence to end. They want their family to stay together. So, so the question is, if I report domestic abuse, does that mean that my marriage will have to end?
No, absolutely not. It's kind of, the two things can run in parallel. So the decision about whether to take someone to court for an offence is made by the police in this country. So they will take the decision about that, and you can go along that route, to court. Obviously, it's very important. People do support the police if they can. But parallel to that, someone will make a decision, do they want to stay in the marriage or not? So absolutely, if they choose to stay in a relationship with a person, even if they are quite abusive, quite violent, that is somebody's choice. The only time that would be different is if it's felt that they're not able to make a safe decision. So actually, when it's kind of really, when people are really concerned about that person's safety, sometimes other measures will be put in place to try and protect the person. So for example, the police are able to apply for a domestic violence protection order. So if they think someone's at really serious harm of being hurt by a perpetrator, and actually if the perpetrator's around them, they haven't got the space in their mind to think about different options and actually what they can do about the relationship, they can apply to the court for an order, which means the person has to stay away for a set amount of time, normally 28 days. And that just gives the victim time to kind of speak to the support services, kind of decide what they want to do, move forwards. Other people sometimes might want to get a non-molestation order put in place. So again, if they want to have that separation from the person, there are a lot of options that people can do to get that. But absolutely, if somebody decides that they do want to stay in that relationship, then that is absolutely their choice.
Mm-hmm. Just another question was, in your experience, have you seen cases where perpetrators have managed to change their behaviour through anger management courses?
Yep. So as I was saying a bit before, really, domestic abuse is quite separate to general anger management. So it's not something that people could go on like a 2-day course, anger management course, and then they'll be like model husbands, mothers, whatever. But it's very much kind of around behaviour change. So we're very fortunate. We've got Hampton Trust in our area, but there's also the Respect National Helpline. So people, if they're living in other parts of the country, if you phone Respect Helpline, they'll be able to tell you where the programmes are in your area. But that is very much based on intervening with the perpetrator. And part of it is education based. So kind of explains to people about the impact of their behaviour on the other person. And are sort of getting that long-term change. So on the whole, those programmes are probably 20 to 24 weeks long. So it's not a short-term fix, because normally someone won't have become quite abusive to their partner over a short period. It will be sort of very much ingrained in them, you know, and it will be going on for a long time. So there's no sort of quick fix, anger management, now you're sorted after a day training course or something. It's very much that kind of long-term change. And the programmes work in that they have, somebody works with the perpetrator to actually look at their behaviour and how they can make those changes. So things, for example, like a timeout technique. So if the person feels they're getting really, really angry and boiling up, they're kind of taught how they can actually just say to their partner, I need some time out. And then they go and leave the house for a certain amount of time, walk around for half an hour, whatever it is, calm down, and then come back and discuss the situation rationally. So yes, there's kind of all those sort of techniques. A lot of the work takes place in groups, so there's a lot of peer sort of support, but also challenge. So actually it's kind of like other people helping each other, really. And you get people who've just started on the programme who always kind of say, I don't need to be here, I haven't got a problem. And then you've got other people who've been on 16 weeks saying, actually, I thought that, but now I found that this has worked for me, and I've, you know, that's happened. Alongside actually the people who are being supported to make the changes, there's also safety workers that work with the other partner, so the wife or the husband or the ex-partner, and they kind of check in and make sure that they're safe. So they do safety planning with that person, and they can also sort of check on what's going on. So obviously a perpetrator is every week going to say they've been wonderful, they haven't done anything wrong all week, they've been model partners. But actually the safety worker checks actually what's happened, you know, were the triggers, how did the person respond? So that kind of balance. And when I did some research, I looked at people who'd been on the programme. So this was a voluntary based community programme, and I actually found about 85% of them, like 2 years after they'd been on the programme, were actually not displaying violence and abuse towards their partner. So it had made a difference. So for some people, it's not going to work. Whatever you do, you know, they're never really going to change. They, you know, they're not able to do that. But for a lot of people, perhaps where they, you know, never been taught really how to handle their emotions, or, you know, they have got other issues going on, which they then take out on their partner. You know, sometimes that education, that bit of support, you know, you've kind of done this, could you have handled it in a different way? So kind of that sort of work, yes, it can really make a change for a lot of people.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Just another question that's coming in on the comment section is there a court order to stop perpetrators from entering victims' homes and seeing kids, but the victim allows the perpetrator anyway? Does that affect the court's decision afterwards during the trial? Or does this mean that the case will be dropped or something?
So the case won't be dropped, because that will carry on. So if an order's been put in place that the person isn't supposed to go to the home, they're not supposed to have any contact, they're not supposed to see the children, if they go to the house and they instigate that contact, even if the person has let them in the door, then they're breaching that order. So they could be seen to be in contempt of court, they could be taken back to court, and they could be fined or punished. They could be sent to prison for breaking that condition. It's also really recognised that obviously if you've got somebody who turns up at your home, even if there's an order in place, if you know they're going to make a massive fuss, you know, banging on the door, is going to be a lot of upset, that obviously puts, you know, people under quite a lot of pressure. So whereas in an ideal situation, you'd see them outside, you obviously don't let them in, you phone the police come. It's also recognised that sometimes that's going to be really difficult for people to do. And actually the onus is all on the perpetrator. That order is in place to tell them you shouldn't be doing this. So actually if they choose to go and do that, then they're breaking that. So that would impact on them and not on the victim. And absolutely it would actually give more weight to the case. So if they're kind of putting an order and they're just ignoring it, then actually then how can they say they can be trusted after, you know, if they're found guilty of an offence, to kind of abide by that? So it's likely that to say the punishment would be harsher if they did that than it would have been otherwise.
It was interesting to hear you mention that the threshold to prove someone guilty is quite high. And I only say that because there's this thinking that the courts are quite lenient to women because of this new fad that is women's rights. And there's some sort of, and if anyone just screams rape or violence, the court sort of just hears them and only them, no one else. So I was wondering if you could just talk more on those thresholds to prove that someone is guilty by the courts.
Yeah, because it is hard, because when we're thinking it's about two people are going to give a totally different account potentially of actually what's happened. So you're going to get one person saying they've been raped, you're going to get one person who's saying it was consensual or not. And it's up to the courts, they've got to kind of try and work out what the truth is. So obviously they're going to be looking at what evidence there is. So it's not just the person's word for it, it's kind of what else there is that might be there to back something up. So for example, if someone's got an injury, or if perhaps somebody heard them shout something, you know, kind of all that evidence. Rape is particularly difficult. Because obviously often it will only be those two people who are actually in that situation, and quite often it is difficult to get that evidence. I mean, if you've got a case of a stranger rape, for example, it might be there's more evidence to gather, but particularly when it's within a marriage, although rape is illegal, it is sometimes quite hard to prove, you know, beyond that threshold, you know, did what they're saying actually happen, you know, in the way they said. So very much kind of looking at for collaborating evidence, you know, who's giving the most consistent account of things. And also they'll be looking at wider evidence. So perhaps, for example, if people have told somebody about what's happened, you know, if they've got any photographs of injuries, all those kind of things help build up the evidence.
And in terms of figures of people reporting, or the numbers of cases of domestic abuse going through the courts, would there be any differences in, I guess, the figures of the wider UK community and the numbers of people from ethnic minority groups like Fijians? Is there any significant difference in the numbers of reporting and cases that are going through to the courts?
Yeah, I mean, the number of incidents that are actually happening should be representative of the community. So if, for example, there's 10% of the community is ethnically diverse, then you would hope that you will get 10% of the reported incidents would be made to the police from the community, and also 10% of the cases going to court. So it should be statistically representative of the community at that point. However, we do know that for some people there are a lot of extra barriers. We kind of talked earlier about if you're on a spousal visa, if you're isolated, if you've got nobody else, if you've got nowhere you can run to, if you don't know what the support services are, all those kind of things. Also culturally, so if domestic abuse in a culture is very kind of accepted, you might put up with a lot more than somebody else might put up with. You know, you might not have the confidence, you might not have the language skills. So actually we do know that probably reports from diverse communities are probably going to be less than they should be statistically, because of all those barriers, all those difficulties people face. But actually the prevalence is probably going to be there, and it's really kind of up to us as support services to be reaching out to communities saying, you know, we are here, we want to help you, you know, please step forward, you know, please do access that support if you need it, and please make those reports when you need to. But yeah, number wise, you will find normally that it's underrepresented to where it should be.
Yes, I could, and I guess we have discussed this while we're preparing for it, like the reports that have been done for Fijians, I guess back home in Fiji, suggest also talk about what you are saying, that there is quite a high prevalence rate of Fijian women who have faced violence at one point in their life. And I think it's quite significantly higher than the global average, where in the UK, it's 1 in every 3 women. For the statistics of Fijian women, it's 1 in 4. And again, this is a national survey that was done in 2011 back home in Fiji, but it's the closest one we can get to gauge those kind of perceptions or attitudes for Fijians here in the UK. And it makes sense and links to what you are saying in terms of the reporting, and that crimes like rape or violence are very underreported, even more so for minority ethnic groups like ours. If you have, I was wondering if you had anything else you would like to add to this section before we move on to the last one.
I think that's it. I mean, if anybody's interested in the statistics and the breakdown, I can get those figures for people. We do also kind of, when the police go to a domestic incident, they'll do a risk assessment with the person who they believe to be the victim at the time. So they'll kind of look at that, and then they'll kind of identify how many risk factors are prevalent. And if it's deemed to be a high risk case, then that goes for a multi-agency response. So again, we've got kind of figures, data about how many of those cases are from minority ethnic groups. Within our area, Rushmore and Hart, we're doing quite well. We're sort of roughly where we should be statistically. But for example, people who've got a disability are very much underrepresented in those figures. You know, there's kind of other factors as well, you know, lots of different factors really that can influence people's ability really to escape from an abusive relationship, and actually to kind of be able to kind of move forward from that. Okay, thank you. So in the next section, I was just going to run through some of the kind of the domestic abuse offences and different things. So so domestic abuse itself isn't legally a law at the moment, so you can't be taken to court for domestic abuse, but these are some of the things that might fit in. So it could be murder, threats to kill, actual bodily harm, criminal damage, revenge porn, we talked about, grievous bodily harm, stalking, harassment, coercive controlling behaviour. And these are all crimes. And when they go to court, they're put into that domestic sort of framework. So a murder against a stranger is kind of dealt with quite differently to a murder of a partner, a domestic partner. So kind of thinking about how the impact of that. It's quite interesting really, because like coercive controlling behaviour is quite a new crime. That was only from 2015, and that really captures that emotional abuse. Before that, really a lot of the crimes, certainly when you're looking at the ones sort of the murder, threats, kill and everything, a lot more around physical harm and things. So coercive controlling behaviour, bringing in that emotional, that psychological abuse, that economic abuse. Stalking and harassment, again, you know, kind of really have a really massive detrimental impact on somebody's life and their well-being. And if you're being stalked, if someone's harassing you the whole time, how that really impacts on you. So all of those are separate crime types, but within, you know, they can fall within that domestic context. So the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, again, this is quite a new thing. I think this came in 2015 as well. So this is where if you've got a new partner or somebody you know's got a partner and you're quite worried about them, you kind of, you notice that actually you think they might have a history of domestic abuse, you kind of wonder what their history is. The Domestic Violence Disclosure Schemes allows anybody to ask about a new partner or somebody they're in a relationship with to actually find out, have they had a history of perpetrating domestic abuse against previous partners. So for example, you meet somebody new, they're really lovely, of course, at the start and everything, but things start to go wrong. They start to be quite controlling with you, you start to get that abuse. It might be that you want to find out, actually, you know, they had a partner before, actually what information have the police got on that person? And everybody has that right to ask for that information. Doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be told anything, because you're only told obviously things that are recorded on the police system that are relevant. So say if they stole a car 10 years ago, you wouldn't be told about that. But if, say, they'd had 5 previous partners, all of which had experienced domestic abuse, then the police would tell you about that so that you can do some safety planning around that. The other part of that law is around the right to know. So if the police are aware that somebody who's had a lot of relationships where there's been domestic abuse, if they're aware there's a new partner, again, they might go and talk to that person and actually say, you know, you've got this new partner and we need to make you aware that actually there's been all these cases in the past. And it's all really about empowering people, and absolutely anybody can ask that question. So say, for example, you've got a sister that you were, or a brother that you were worried about, they were in a relationship and you really felt uneasy about the partner, you can actually go to the police and you can ask them to check into the history for that person. So if they find anything relevant, they won't give you the information because you're not directly impacted, but they would say if it was your sister's new partner you're worried about, they'd speak to your sister and actually give her that information, or your brother the information, so they could make an informed decision and actually know about the background to that person. So in terms of impact of domestic abuse, again, this is going to be really unique to each individual person. So everybody is going to have different concerns. You know, it's going to impact people in different ways. These are just some of the common ways, really, you know, a lot of people have experienced. So a lot of victims feel scared and frightened, isolated. They feel ashamed about what's happened. They might hate the person and others for what's happening. Worry about the children, that's really kind of high prevalence. Concerned about immigration status, finances, scared to return to other family members, so perhaps returning to home countries, and worried about consequences of the decisions they make. So those are really sort of common impacts on victims. In terms of impacts on children, you can get those physical injuries if they get in the middle of fights, if they're directly abused, again feeling very scared, frightened, isolated. They might feel they can't talk to anyone about what's happening. They might be told, this is our family secret, don't tell anyone. And again, you can get that whole spectrum of kind of reactions. So some children will internalise what's happening. They might be very quiet, very meek, sort of trying to sort of almost hide from everything. Or they could be quite disruptive, you know, at school they could keep getting into trouble. Could be bedwetting, anxious, all those kind of impacts. And again, depending on the age of the children, different impacts that they'll have and different ways of coping. And then domestic abuse also impacts on perpetrators. So again, they might kind of feel ashamed of what's happening. They might feel very jealous, possessive of their partner. Again, might feel isolated, guilty, might feel out of control. But they might also try and push the blame onto others. You know, if you didn't do this, I wouldn't have to do this. So that kind of thing. They might be scared about what's happening, and they might also minimise the impact. And one of the good things about Respect Helpline and also the Hampton Trust is that actually people are worried about their behaviour. They can talk to someone who understands, and actually they can say, this is what's happening, this is how I'm feeling. They won't be judged, they'll be sort of helped to get some help and try and sort of, if they really want to truly access help and change their behaviour, that support is there for them as well. Okay, so that's kind of just some of the impacts.
Thank you, Catherine. Sorry, thank you, Karen. Thinking back to our last session with Karen.
My background's getting yellower and lower, isn't it? As the light changes.
There's just one question here. I think that is really interesting, your previous section that you just presented, and we can go back to that. But just some questions that came in. The first one was, what is the situation where there is a constant absence of the soldiers on deployment on deployment or exercise, and problems about money? I guess this is a question around economic or financial abuse.
Yeah, so is this where perhaps the soldier could be posted away and they don't leave any money for the family while they're away?
Yes, or very little as a means of control, I guess.
Yeah. So again, that would come under the economic abuse. I mean, I'm aware of people who've been posted abroad and they're still doing the online shopping abroad. So the person who's actually here in the country isn't even allowed to go to the shops to get anything. They've got no access to finances at all, and that makes life extremely difficult, because there's lots of things that kind of expectedly come up. So there might be a school trip, or, well, probably not at the moment with COVID, but there's kind of all those little expenses that come up, and actually if you haven't got any money, that really kind of impacts on someone. And then having to speak to them and say, oh, please can I have £5 for this, that and the other. Yes, absolutely a way of someone might really be controlling someone like that. Occasionally, somebody does control the finances for sort of, because actually that's the way they find that, the family dynamics work, or perhaps the other person isn't comfortable with money, but those situations are really quite rare. So yeah, quite often it is that sort of that control, and absolutely that comes under that economic abuse.
Another question was, is there an impact on the soldier's military career if someone reports domestic abuse?
Again, there can be. So it depends on the circumstances as to what happens. So if you report domestic abuse, then that is one of the things people are worried, is it going to impact on the career? It's quite a difficult one to answer in a way, because obviously, it's only right that the sanctions are put on somebody. So actually, if they're being very abusive, very violent at home, it isn't really right that they would get promotion, for example. You wouldn't want them to have access to weapons, all those kind of things. So there can sometimes be an impact. However, that is kind of weighed up against the safety of the victim and actually the impact on the whole family. So in some circumstances, there won't be like a direct impact on the career. But at least if the military are kind of aware of all the situation, what's happening and everything, they can make decisions on that basis. And again, it would depend who you report to. So if you report to, say, civilian police, unless the person's arrested, it wouldn't necessarily get back to the unit. If they are arrested, then that would do. And obviously there could be sanctions, because again, they're breaking all the service conditions around conduct and everything. And again, people can access support from civilian support service or military support services, depending on how they feel sort of safest. But I mean, yes, there can be impact sometimes. And I know that is a concern for people, but absolutely the overriding priority of the army and everybody is the safety of the victim and children.
Mm-hmm. I guess that would, the impact on someone's career, be it military or anything else, would pale in comparison to, for an example, the loss of life or injury, or the lack of safety, I guess, for victim and children. Another question was, what about in instances where religious teachings are used to keep women in abusive situations?
Yeah, and again, sometimes people will misquote passages from the Bible or the Quran or the religious text and that, but there isn't any religion at all that says it's okay to abuse anybody or to harm anybody. And actually, it's just the words are taken out of context. So wives, submit to your husband, that kind of thing. But that is very much taken out of context, because there's other parts of the Bible and the teachings and that are very much, you must look after that person, love your neighbour as yourself, and all those kind of things. So yeah, we quite often do quite a bit of work with the religious leaders, and they will kind of reinforce that actually, there's nowhere that says that anybody deserves to be abused, or that it's okay for anyone to abuse somebody else.
That's true. I think that the verse in Ephesians 5 is often used, submit to your husband, sorry, as a way, I guess, of silencing people that do speak up, or keeping women in situations that might disrupt the power dynamics that exist, or the status quo. And it was interesting. I had attended a talk on this that was organized by a faith-based group. And I found the response to a question raised around the same point very interesting, where the speaker explained it in a beautiful way, I would say. And he said that in that passage in the Bible where that says a woman must submit to your husband, it's sort of submitting to in a way, you look at it and it's submitting to a mission that is godly. And you don't only look at that section of it. There's another half of the chapter that says husband should love your wife as you would your own body, or the body of Christ, etc. So in a way, when you're submitting to something that isn't in line with the mission of Christ, or then you're submitting to something else where you are then not safe, or in putting yourself and your children in harm's way, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the last question that had come in regarding that section. I guess what interesting part about that section you had just touched on that I wanted to reiterate was that, for an example, if I had a sister or a friend who I was worried about, I had the option of going to the police to ask for information about that person. And I may not always get the information from the police. The police will give it to the relevant person. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wasn't aware of that.
I think it's really important as well, because quite often it's very difficult. You don't want to be seen to be interfering, and people are really hesitant to actually kind of interfere, even if it's like a neighbour or something. If you call the police, what are the implications, what's going to happen? And actually this is kind of a way of sort of finding, making sure that the person who needs to know the information can get it if there's something really relevant for them to know. But it's quite empowering. And the reason that law came in, it was a case in Manchester. There was a lady called Claire who was murdered, and her dad in the coroner's court said that had she known about the person that she was with, that he got this massive history, she wouldn't have stayed. He didn't think she'd have made the decision to stay with them. So that law was put in place to try and protect other people against that. And actually I've got a friend, Celia Peachy, and her mum was murdered, and he'd already committed a murder in Germany, and her mum didn't know about that. And again, it's how that kind of impacts on someone. If because often people only tell you the information they want you to know. Coronation Street, going back to that again, I think it's going to come out, isn't it? His previous partner's now visiting Yasmin in jail. So probably it'll come out about all the abuse and that he subjected her to. But, people don't always kind of take that on board, and actually kind of finding out about that information can really sort of help people. I mean, they might still choose to remain in that relationship, but they're much more kind of equipped. They've got the facts and everything. And if they start to see these things repeating, this pattern, at least they're a little bit better prepared to actually be able to do something about it.
That's so true. It's better that they have the information to be able to make that decision, as opposed to making that decision without the information. There's one question that came in on the comment section, which is, will it affect the victim's spouse visa extension if the couple chooses to stay together and extend the visa for the wife? Or will the police record on the husband's affect the wife, or will the police's records on the husband affect the wife's visa processing in any way?
So it kind of depends what visa extension you're looking for. If you're here on a spousal visa and your spouse is kind of supporting your extension, then and you're still together, then there won't be any impact on that. I suppose, because quite often the spouse might kind of try and hold that over someone. So they'll say that you have to stay with me, or you can't get an extension, you'll have to go back home, all those kind of things. So it depends on the sort of nature of the extension. So the police record on the husband, I don't think that would affect the wife's visa to stay. Obviously, if there's domestic abuse is registered, and that's all on the record of the husband, then in some ways that helps the wife to actually apply for leave to remain in their own right. Because again, for some people, if you've got leave to remain in your own right, that's really quite empowering, because you're not then as dependent on the spouse moving forwards. But it wouldn't in any way make the situation worse for a victim, because you've actually reported and that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Those are all the questions that we had received in the build-up and during the session. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to sort of round up our session tonight?
I think that's fine. I just wanted to kind of talk through a bit of some of the support that's available for people. So there's a variety of support, and it all kind of depends on each person as an individual as to what feels like the best support for you. Obviously the police, if there's an emergency, if someone's being harmed, if there's crimes taking place, the police are there to support everyone, and we kind of talked about that today. There's also armed forces based support. So for example, Army Welfare Service. We've also got the unit welfare officers, chain of command, all those people within the military system. The benefit of Army Welfare Service is that they're confidential, so you can go and speak to them and get help, and they don't share that information with the chain of command. So it is confidential based support, and it's really helpful because they understand the military system, so they can help get things put in place for you that a civilian service wouldn't be able to. If, however, you're really worried about if you access armed forces information, and support through that, if you're worried about any implications at all, you can always go just direct to a civilian support service. And in a way, you're quite lucky in the armed forces because you've got those options. So you've got all the civilian support and also all the armed forces support. So you can choose what feels best for you. So some of the things that people are going to be looking at is safety planning. So it's going to be talking through your individual situation and helping you understand how to keep safe. So that could be something like, for example, if you're worried that if a fight kicks off and everything, you're going to be harmed. Things like making sure that you're not in the kitchen when that happens, where someone might have access to weapons. Thinking about if you needed to leave the house in a hurry, could you leave a bag somewhere? Have you got somewhere you can run to? Have you got a bit of emergency money so you can get somewhere? So all those kind of things about thinking about what can you do. Also, if you decide to leave a relationship, that can be quite a dangerous time for people. So again, help, planning that, so how you can safely leave. Refuge accommodation or safe accommodation. So if you're not safe to stay in your own home, you're worried you're going to get harmed, then there's options around refuge accommodation. So these are safe places where you can go. There's sort of secret locations so people don't know where you are. And there'll be other people there who are in similar situations. So you can get peer support alongside the support of the project workers. For people who haven't got any recourse to public funding, SAFAs have got some accommodation that is available for people to use through the stepping stones. So again, you've got an additional option there to what civilian people would have. Target hardening measures. This is around if it's safe for you to stay in your own home where you are now with extra measures put in place, then there's funding and support to enable you to do that. So for example, if it might be perhaps a door lock on the door, it might be that you get window alarms, safety alarms, things like that really, just trying to make a property a bit more secure for you. So like the question that came in earlier about if, say, they're separated and the person turns up trying to have contact with the children. So trying to make it so that house is safe for you for the 5 minutes or whatever it takes for the police to get there. So about just reinforcing those kind of external mechanisms. Practical supports available, so advice on benefits, immigration applications, all those kind of like practical measures that you might need to get in place. And also that emotional support. So actually having someone to talk to about what's happening, getting some help with that. There's quite a few groups that are available to people if you want to meet with other people. Freedom Programme, for example, is for women who've left the relationship. There's also recovery programmes, there's different programmes, so you can meet with other people if you kind of feel that would be helpful. Support around legal options, so thinking about non-molestation orders, so the person can't, there's an order that they can't come near you or contact you, that type of thing. So thinking about those options, and immigration advice. So that's just some of the sort of support that's available to people. And there's lots of information you can get. We've got national telephone lines that you can call. Sorry, it is, yeah, next slide, thank you. So these are the national telephone lines. So there's a number for female victims, one for male victims, LGBTQ plus victims, and also there's a line for perpetrators. And for the perpetrator helpline, you can also call there if you're a practitioner, or say if you're worried about your partner's behaviour, you can phone them for advice as well. And then Childline is confidential support for children and young people. And then I've just put internet-based information, which is kind of a bit bland really, but that's kind of all the websites. And once you've kind of identified like the situation you're in as domestic abuse, if you type in domestic abuse on the internet, you'll find absolutely loads and loads of information come up. On the Women's Aid website, there's a really good booklet called The Survivor's Handbook, and that gives you lots of practical information about housing, finances, that type of thing. Victim support, citizen advice, all those places have got information and help about what your options are. We have got some Fijian language information booklets as well. So just mainly in plain English, but just explaining about what types of abuse it might be and also what support you can get. And we've got the Armed Forces Domestic Abuse website. If you just Google Armed Forces Domestic Abuse, you come to an MOD website, and on that we've got information which kind of talks you through the practicalities. So what's the difference between Unit Welfare and Army Welfare Service, for example? What support can you get from the chain of command? You know, what are the contact details for Army Welfare Service? Case studies about people who've been helped, and all that information is all together on that website. So there is information out there. And again, if you've got any specific queries, you know, Father can always contact me, or you can contact me direct. That's absolutely fine. I've just realised I put my office number, and of course at the moment I'm on a mobile number, but I can send that over if you are sharing the slides or need to distribute that. So people have got a mobile number they can contact me on. So, oh, you're on mute at the moment.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for that. I'm just mindful that we are now close to 9:30. It's been such a wonderful session, and you've given us so many nuggets of information. And I wish we could go on, but I'm mindful that you would want to continue with your evening as well, with your family and everyone else as well that's tuning in. Do you have any final thoughts to round off the session?
So it's just really, if you're suffering from domestic abuse, or you know anybody who is, there is lots and lots of support available. We've got lots of legal options through the police and the court system. We've also got options through the family court system. We've got lots of support through the Armed Forces network, and also civilian support. So please don't suffer in silence. You know, if you're worried, even if you just want to phone one of those helplines, you don't even have to give your name or your number or anything. You know, and just say, this is my situation, what do you think? You know, should I be worried about this? Have you got any advice for me? You know, please just reach out and get that help. That's really important. Just speak to someone about what's happening. Because the trouble is, if nobody speaks to anyone and it all becomes secret, then actually you can sort of end up in quite a dangerous situation and really kind of isolated. Whereas actually, you know, you do need to get help from other people, and people are there to help you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Karen. I guess I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Maram Alliance UK committee and our advisory members, as well as everyone tuning in tonight, to say thank you very much for taking your time out to give us the information that you've done. It's been very informative and useful, and a great insight into what is the UK criminal justice system. Prior to this, for a lot of us, it just seemed like this big institution that was a bit vague, and we didn't really have much understanding of it. But after tonight's session, I think that's changed for a lot of us. So thank you very much. And thank you for coming forward and contacting us to run this session with you. It's been very open of you and very generous, and we're very grateful, and we look forward to working with you again in future.
That's great, thank you. And thank you to all of you, and thank you for everyone for tuning in, because I know it's a really difficult subject. The more we can talk about this, the better, and hopefully we sort of spread that awareness, and gradually hopefully things will sort of really improve for everybody. But thank you for letting me come on the session, really appreciated it. Thank you.
Naka, Karen, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed the session as much as we've enjoyed delivering it.